For those who are joining first time, Vatigudi Foundation is a not-for-profit organization based out of Detroit, and
Up next is Dr. Vasundhara Atre. She's the Director Medical Operations of Fortis Healthcare. The telemedicine guidelines 2020 are the central framework around which virtual healthcare has to be delivered in India. So, Dr. Vasundhara, can you take us through the important aspects of these guidelines and throw some light on the barriers and medical legal implications of these guidelines? Dr. Vasundhara.
Thank you, Dr. Vidya, for that. And coming straight to the point, as we have been hearing that telemedicine is all about timely access and actually getting access to medical care where otherwise it would not have been available. Interestingly, all of us have been actually practicing telemedicine in one form or the other. So whether it has been the telephone call from your patient or a WhatsApp message that you've been answering, directly or indirectly, we all have been practicing it. It was only in the wake of the corona pandemic that we faced last year in March 2020 that we actually had a formalization of some guidelines relating to telemedicine. Till that time, it was a gray area and all of us were not sure whether we could legally actually practice telemedicine in the country. So these are very interesting guidelines and the guidelines were very clear. So I'm just going to go through the highlights because it's almost a 35, 36 page document. I will just touch on the highlights. So first of all, it very clearly defined who is a registered medical practitioner as a person who could actually practice telemedicine in the country. It was anybody who is registered with the state medical register or in the Indian Medical Register at the national level. And this was as per the Indian Medical Council Act of 1956. Now the caveat here is that from the time that these guidelines come into existence, there is supposed to be certain modules that are going to be released by the Board of Governors who have taken over or superseded the Indian Medical Council. And those who want to continue practicing would actually have to take these modules. And going forward, to qualify as an RMP, we would have to undergo a qualifier before we could go ahead and practice medicine. So looking at that, we are already well into the 3 years. So this is something that we should be looking at going forward. Now there are certain scenarios which have been discussed as to when and who can practice, with whom can you practice it. So these scenarios are basically that it can be a registered medical practitioner who's counseling a patient directly. He could be actually counseling the caregiver. There could be an RMP to the healthcare worker, RMP to another registered medical practitioner, and in emergency situations. So these are 5 scenarios which have actually been looked at by the telemedicine guidelines. Now, the type of consultations that one is allowed to do is basically, it can be a first time consultation. It can be a follow-up consultation that you're doing. By a follow-up consultation, it means that within 6 months, we are doing a repeat consultation when the patient has already been seen with us or under a treatment. What it says is that in case there are any new symptoms, which are not a continuation of the old symptoms, or in any situation where the registered medical practitioner does not remember the context of the last consultation. In both these eventualities, a telemedicine consultation should not be undertaken by the registered medical practitioner. There are 7 elements which have been discussed. It talks about the context in which the consultation can happen. It is important that there is an identification of both the patient and the registered medical practitioner in the sense that they both introduce themselves at the beginning. The mode of communication, because please remember, it can be, I can have a phone call, which is a voice. It can be a text. It can actually be a video consultation. It can be a combination of the modes. It can happen in 2 particular scenarios. That is, either it is a real time or it is asynchronous, where I have shared the details or the patient has shared the details in advance. And then I go in for the consultation after all the details have been received by me. So it is actually happening in 2 stages. The next thing is about the consenting. Now, consenting part is important because you need to first identify whether it is a patient who's talking to us directly. Is it a caregiver? Is it a minor or an adult that we are consulting at that point in time? And now, very much like we do a consultation in the hospital, it is presumed that if the patient has initiated, it is taken for granted that a consent is in place. However, it is advised that we actually look at getting a formal consent before the start of the consultation. Also, it will depend upon the type of consultation that we are doing. It is important that we get a complete patient evaluation like we would do in a normal consultation. And then, of course, how we would go about engaging this patient depending upon the level of care that is required. In addition to all of these, there are certain caveats about the prescription. Now, it is very well defined as to how the prescription is to be written. But what we need to understand is actually what are the drugs that we can and cannot prescribe as per the guidelines. The categorization of drugs is very simple. There is an O category of drugs, which actually means over-the-counter drugs, which we would normally prescribe and we are allowed to prescribe. The second category of drugs which is there, which is the A category of drugs, which you can actually do or prescribe the drugs, which is a continuation in a follow-up. That is what you're advised to do. Now, they also suggest and what type of a consultation can we do this prescription. So while for the other categories, we can use any, for this particular category of drugs that we are going to be prescribing under the A category, it has to be a video consultation only, because at this point in time, it is suggested that the patient may be having new symptoms other than the ones for which the previous prescription was actually written out. The third category is actually your B category. And this would be a new consultation or new level of drugs that you're trying to add into it. And last category is, of course, our Schedule X drugs and the drugs which are coming under the narcotic and the psychotropic substances. So these are all have a high potential of abuse, and these drugs cannot be given as part of a tele-prescription, so to say. Now, these are the good things that we have some guidelines in place. Please understand that there are certain exclusions and things that we should actually be asking for clarity as we go forward on the telemedicine journey. One is, we do not have the hardware and the software, the infrastructure building or the maintenance part, which has been defined for us. So these have been excluded in the guidelines. Second thing is the type of data management systems that can be involved in terms of standards and the interoperability have also not been defined. Use of digital technology for the purpose of conducting any surgical or invasive procedures also is not allowed or not been defined under these guidelines. The other aspects such as research, evaluation, or education part, that is a telehealth part of it, has also not been covered. And it does not pertain to any kind of teleconsultation outside the jurisdiction of India. Another caveat that is there is that any platform, AI platform, that is your artificial intelligence powered platforms, where it is possible for the platform itself to suggest a diagnosis or a treatment, is something that we cannot use for the purpose of a teleconsultation. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. Also, I'm sure that all of us have experienced, for any of us who have actually tried the telemedicine, that there are two very big areas of dilemma for us. One is regarding the privacy of the consultation, because at the time of the consultation, it would depend upon where the patient is, where the doctor is actually sitting, the kind of people or the people who are actually walking in and out during the consultation actually going on. And the second part of it is, I think, the dignity that we all practice at the time of the teleconsultation. Where are we sitting? How are we sitting? What is our attire at the time of it? Both from the perspective of the RMP as well as the patient that we are consulting. So this is not to say that teleconsultation cannot be done or there are too many barriers to it. This is to say that this is the way forward. There are now some basic guidelines, and it is for us, and I'm sure Dr. Vidya will be defining later on as to what are the steps we should be taking to actually make it more robust and allow us to do more of this. So thank you, Dr. Vidya. Back to you.
Dilip, you started high acuity virtual medicine even before the telemedicine guidelines came out. So what made you, how did you feel when the court ruled against a virtual consultation?
They actually didn't, rule it in a way that actually hurt us, because we were going according to the IT Act of 2000 and 2002 with its amendment, which actually did allow some form of telemedicine as long as you had consent and you had appropriate documentation in place. Those guidelines were very rudimentary, and even from 2000 and 2002 onwards, institutes such as Sanjay Gandhi, ISRO, the Indian Army, and on the private sector, Apollo, have been doing telemedicine in various capacities under the ambit of that law and that act. So again, I think when we dug further, we found that it's technically not illegal, but it's not been fleshed out in the degree that it needs to be. And then as I look at it oftentimes, sometimes, not sometimes, almost every time, you need to do something that is in the interest of a population, the legal framework often lags behind. And it may lag behind by years in some cases. Automated driving that Tesla and Google and other companies are pioneering actually drag the legal system behind them to make sure that this happens in the interest of the population. So I think some of that is certainly at play here, where the legal system will lag behind. But as long as the intent is correct and the beneficiary ends up being patient-centric, it's hard to find a situation where the law would actually object to it. And that, in some ways, is up to the guardians of the healthcare industry, which would be healthcare givers, such as nurses and doctors, to make sure that these boundaries and barriers are well defined, so that the legal system can actually piggyback on this and do a better job than they would have done without the healthcare industry taking the lead on it.
How do you do your consenting process, Dilip?
Sorry, Dr. Vasundhara, you had something to say. I'll answer that in a second.
Yeah. So, Dr. Dilip, I was basically coming in to say that I totally agree with you that telemedicine is the way forward, and especially given our population and the kind of reach that we require to deliver the healthcare services. I would actually appeal to my colleagues in the industry that, a lot of the times the law comes down hard on us because we actually tend to deviate, and we have a few people who do it and everybody else pays the price. So I think it is also up to us to really ensure that the good that we are trying to do is really in the interest of the population. So that is where I would rest my appeal and rest my case.
Vidya, could I butt in for a second? It's very pertinent.
Absolutely, sir. Yeah, it's all yours.
Vasundhara, you raised a very important point, and to me, for some time, it looked like you are talking as a lawyer rather than a physician, and that's the way it should be. Guidelines are always made keeping the least of the variability of it, and I can just relate it with the Organ Transplant Act. Sanjay Gandhi did first cadaveric transplant without any law. And I argued with luminaries, legal luminaries, before doing the transplant. The time was very limited. And my premise was there is no law for it, but there is no law against it. And we argued with it. And they advised me that don't take both the kidneys, take only one kidney. Because according to, they say that if somebody complains, it would be a big legal hassle, which you should be prepared, but we'll be able to bail out, as Dilip said, that your bona fide is not immoral or something. And we will say that if there is no law, it is not the fault of the society, it is the fault of the lawmakers. And in this situation, go by the law of the land, like what is happening in other countries. Now, one point I would like to say, for 16 years, I have been in a very tightly HIPAA protected environment. And now GDPR is the grandfather of HIPAA. And we do databases. And one thing which is universal there is the free will of the patient. And that is what is very important in this. In the same transplant example, that opt-out law of Singapore gave them more cadaveric organs. So for India, I think I would like you to comment briefly on the legal status, that if I have a freedom to give my data to anybody or give a consent to anybody, should we plead for an opt-out law, by wherein if the patient initiates a telemedicine consult, he gives his consent to the physician and physicians are protected.
So what I would like to put forth here is that any consent, like we take even in the normal consultation or for a surgery, it works in a similar manner. However, for example, if I am doing the data, it would depend. So if it is an anonymized data, there is actually no problem there. But the moment that there is an identity which is attached to the data, and there is a data privacy issue which comes into play, if the patient is giving it to us, then it has to be very definitive as to what I can do and cannot do with that data. And there should be an opt-out from the consent as well. Because if you're talking about free will, if I feel that my data is...
Exactly, that's what I'm trying to say. That we cannot assume that since the patient asks for a consultation, it's all covered. Now, we should be working, because in India, I have been equally practicing with Indian patients. 90% of them are not bothered about these issues. They have a problem, they want to consult, they send you the data as you want it. So I would say that we should rather work on that area to secure a physician where the patient is willing to give a consent. It is something like signing a disclaimer for Google or Apple. Nobody looks at 10 pages, said, I have read it, and you agree to all that. So I think that's the point which I don't want to take too much of time. Vidya, thank you. We can talk for hours, but
if I could interrupt, the good news is that the telemedicine guidelines are being revised, and one of our JIPMA alumnus, Dr. Nalin Mehta, and another batchmate of mine, also they are all involved in that. So hopefully we'll be seeing some, revision which will take telemedicine forward. So going back to you, Dilip, how do you do the consenting when a patient calls and asks for a consultation? We are saying the consent is implicit. How does that work in tele ICU?
Yeah, so in the outpatient space, what you said is right. However, I do foresee a consent manager that is mandated by NDHM to go live very soon. People are working on that sandbox as we speak, and that is the right way to go forward. In the ICU space, we have an agreement with the hospital where a consent for telemedicine is taken a priori at the time of admission in a detailed format, just like you would take consent for other procedures that are part of the ICU as standard procedure. Of course, there is a right to rescind that at any point in time. And we share a list of all our doctors and their qualifications with the hospital as if we are empaneled doctors in that hospital. So the consent is built into that as if we are a team of that hospital, which we are, and that is the right way to do it. Because you want to be providing consent with certified providers, credential providers in that hospital. So once that is in place, then they know that they're being monitored. They have consent for video monitoring and for care that is augmented in addition to their doctors at bedside. So very explicitly, we state that this does not mean, the hospital states actually on behalf of the platform, that you are going to have doctors at bedside. This is an augmentative service and does not replace bedside care.
Right. Thank you, Dilip, for that clarification.